Hello, I'm Sophia Besch, and this is the World Unpacked. This is a special edition of the program featuring a conversation with two of my colleagues, Chris Chivvis, Senior Fellow and Director of the American Statecraft Program, and Stephen Wertheim, Senior Fellow in the American Statecraft Program, on the Biden administration's foreign policy legacy. Enjoy the show.
The president-elect has a philosophy of history. You know, Barack Obama had his long arc that bends toward justice.
Right.
President Trump's philosophy of history is we'll see what happens. So
right.
we could
So
apply
it's
that.
like,
Yes.
could apply Trumpian uncertainty. I mean, this doesn't have to be entirely backward looking. We can also think a little bit about what challenges the incoming administration is going to face and how they might perform on those big challenges that they're going to have. So,
Sure.
and you've obviously, written a fair amount about this. I've written some about it and done some public speaking on it. What's happened in the Middle East is, at least for me, somewhat unexpected. I mean, I don't think I would have predicted at the beginning of 2024 that Israel would be in as strong of a position relative to Iran and its other adversaries as it is today militarily. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. I mean, Israel has made significant gains. It's really shifted the balance of power in its favor over the course of the last year through its military campaigns against Hamas, campaigns that were then expanded, obviously, to include Hezbollah and Iran itself. But, and this is the big but, I mean, all of that, shift in the balance of power has come at an exorbitant cost to the region, and my sense is also to America because of its unflinching, sometimes, even unconsidered support for Israel.
Yeah, I mean, for me, first of all, I share your ambivalence about the state of play in the Middle East. I mean, on one level, the way in which Iran and its so-called axis of resistance has been weakened, from the perspective of U.S. interests conventionally defined, at least, it's hard not to look at the result and say that
that part of it is not so bad. It's actually pretty good.
So I have to acknowledge that as somebody who was pretty critical all along,
completely agree with you.
of U.S. policy over the last year and of Israeli actions. That fact does bear, acknowledging. At the same time, I'm not sure we're going to, feel so good about things over the medium to long term, because the balance of power has shifted, but that doesn't mean political problems have been solved. To me, it goes back to the very beginning of the Israel-Gaza war. The Biden administration began in the opening weeks by saying, we support Israel, we want to provide billions in aid to Israel, and there are really no conditions on this support, political support, and military aid. So we will give you the aid, and then at the same time, we'll give you advice about what we think you should do. But we're not going to link those two things together. It's sort of hard to forget, or it's easy to forget, rather, that President Biden, said publicly in the opening weeks after Hamas's attack on October 7th, 2023, that he thought an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza was a bad idea.
So let me give you my thoughts on why I think this was not the right way to pursue this policy, because obviously tons of people disagree with us about this. I mean, there are a lot of people who just believe that, de facto the United States should support Israel to the maximum extent possible. They consider the idea of any kind of restriction in U.S. weapons supply to be anathema to what the U.S.-Israel relationship is about and very dangerous for America's role in the world. But so I have basically three reasons why I think it wasn't in the U.S. interest to go so deep and so long on Israel's military campaign against Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. And so the first one is probably the one that I think most people share in terms of the critics that we've heard on the Hill of Biden's support to Israel, in terms of the criticisms that we've seen on campuses all over the United States in 2024. And this is just the humanitarian cost for the people of Gaza. I mean, it's really, really hard to watch that, even for someone who's a realist. So I don't want to put too strong of an emphasis on this, but it is really heart-wrenching to see what was happening and to feel that our country was so closely associated with that.
And it's still happening, and how Gaza will end up has completely not been resolved.
Yeah, absolutely. The second one is the extent to which our unflinching support for the Netanyahu government was emboldening him into a more aggressive approach, not just in Gaza, also with Hezbollah, and especially with Iran. And my concern has been, and continues to be, potentially even more so with Trump now coming in, that unflinching support is going to get Israel into a much broader war than it's already in with Iran, and that the United States could easily get pulled into that kind of a conflict. And people may say, oh, that's ridiculous. The United States is not going to go directly to war with Iran. We don't have to worry about that. But I'm not so convinced that that's actually a risk that we don't have to worry about. I mean, I think if you go back, to put yourself in 1999, for example, there was obviously a big standoff between the United States and Iraq at the time. But the idea that the United States was going to conduct a ground invasion of Iraq was not on anyone's radar. I mean, so I think fast forwarding to today, we have to be thinking about the way in which the policies that we undertake, the rhetoric that we use, sets up that as a real possibility, even though it would be a complete strategic disaster for the United States to get into some kind of a protracted war with Iran in the Middle East.
So the risk that political scientists would call the risk of entrapment.
Right.
There's always a risk when you have allies, including weaker allies, but allies who feel that their security is in jeopardy, and at the end of the day, if they stick their neck out, the United States will be there to support them. And I find it very unlikely that a U.S. president, perhaps particularly President Trump, would, if faced with a situation in which Iran was attacking Israel and leaving Israel very vulnerable, they wouldn't come to the defense of Israel.
I think you're right. I mean, I think the thing with Trump is that, because there's so much hostility towards Iran in the Republican Party, just the fact of him coming into office is going to further encourage and embolden Netanyahu to take risks that he might not otherwise take. So I think that this risk, if anything, is going to grow in 2025, the risk of entrapment, as you put it, or emboldenment, or both. And it's one that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to. But let me get to my third reason, which has to do with how this is viewed around the world, and especially by the world's emerging power, something that we've written about some over the course of 2024 in our report on emerging powers and a couple of articles. I think that if you're a U.S. Middle East expert, the fact that Brazil is critical of Israel or South Africa is critical of Israel, these seem like facts. I mean, the idea that South Africa would pull Israel before the International Court of Justice doesn't seem like all that big of a deal if you're a U.S. Middle East expert and really thinking about this in depth. But, for me, trying to look at this from a global strategic perspective, those are the emerging powers that the United States is really going to need in order to shape the future world order in the way that we want it to look. And so the fact that they are so critical of Israel is in fact really pertinent. It's much more pertinent than I think a lot of people have recognized.
Yeah, I took a few trips this past year. One of them was to Singapore and another to South Africa. And in both places, there was a desire to talk about how bad U.S. policy was in the Middle East. I think for the Singaporeans, it was more the international law violations that Israel was committing and the U.S. was enabling, although others in the region as well have sympathy for the Palestinians. Think of Malaysia, think of Indonesia. These are significant countries when it comes to Indo-Pacific. South Africa, obviously, their Palestinian flags were on people's homes. And, the perception of the United States, it's not like these issues are quarantined in people's minds. It reflects how they think about the United States. It then reflected how they might then think about China or Russia. And just to give one more riff on this, I think it's easy for policymakers cloistered in the White House to say, yeah, we could see how many around the world see the United States as hypocritical, but how does that actually affect our relationships? So they will say, look, there isn't one government in the Middle East that doesn't want to work with the United States today because of our policies toward Israel, toward Gaza, et cetera. And that may be true. And yet, at the same time, what you're saying is also true, that over the long term, the perceptions of the United States in many countries that will become important or are already important to us have really taken a hit. It's sort of incredible how from the very beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine, there were already a lot of charges around the world that the United States was hypocritical because of its policies toward Israel-Palestine.
Right.
It was, opposing the seizure of territory, annexation, illegal invasion in one case and not another. And in fact, the United States even took a supportive position of war crimes allegations against Vladimir Putin. And then, of course, October 7th happened, and the contradiction was put front and center in people's faces. And that's, I think, going to shape the perception of people for a long period of time. These are the kinds of events that get left indelibly in the minds of people in their formative years and then linger on for generations.
And I think obviously people in the United States as well as especially around the world. But I mean, maybe I want to talk a little bit sort of directly about why it was hard for Biden to restrain Netanyahu. I mean, this was the theory, and I bought it at the start more than you did, frankly, after watching the horror that was October 7, and sort of, you're left flabbergasted with, well, what on earth policy could work here? And so when the administration came out at, I guess in roughly November of 2023, and it became apparent that their strategy was, the bear hug, that, by embracing Netanyahu, they would have more control. I said, okay, well, that's a plausible theory. Certainly by distancing themselves from Netanyahu, it's going to be hard to have much influence. But as it turned out, it didn't really work. They didn't really have that much influence over Netanyahu. They found themselves constantly berated in the press by him. And even when they temporarily suspended the delivery of JDAMs back in the spring, they changed course and didn't really go through with it. And of course, all the other types of military assistance that the United States provides to Israel continued. So the question is, why has it been so hard for Biden to allies? And here's where I'm going with this. It's not just Israel, right? It's also been Ukraine, and this has been a big issue for me. And when we talk about Ukraine, I think that the United States it's just tragic in a way.
I want to try to be precise about why I think Biden adopted this bear hug approach. And I think the main answer is the perceptions of American domestic politics. Mm-hmm. And I want to distinguish perceptions from the reality of American domestic politics, because Biden didn't really try to put the hammer down on Netanyahu at any point. What our domestic politics would allow was not tested.
So I think we should talk some about Ukraine because, I mean, for me personally, I think I should just say it's the issue that I'm the most emotional about. I found the most difficult to explain my thinking in ways that get a positive reception out there in Washington and in Europe. And, looking back on how things have unfolded over the course of the last, coming up on 3 years now, and having been pretty critical of the way in which NATO and America has approached the war, it would be easy to feel a sense of schadenfreude. And somebody asked me the other day whether I do, and I really don't. I just feel like it's so tragic. I really feel as though the United States has done a disservice to Ukraine by way overpromising what the United States was realistically going to provide to the Ukrainian people, to the Ukrainian government, and doing it for what were oftentimes the right reasons, coming from a good place of empathy for the Ukrainian people, and I totally understand that, but also sometimes doing it for our own domestic political purposes. I've noticed this sort of, it's almost predictable, but this emerging critique of Biden's policy with Ukraine, which says he should have done a lot more to help the Ukrainians earlier on. For example, he should have lifted restrictions on the use of U.S. ATACMS and allowed Ukraine to strike more deeply into Russian territory because, and this is how the theory goes, we now know that there were no escalatory risks because look at what's happened, which is that, Ukraine is now doing this and Russia hasn't responded by, shooting an ICBM at the United States or something like that. And so this argument is really starting to take hold, and I'm hearing it from a growing number of people, both in Europe and in Washington. There was a great article in Bloomberg the other day about this, and I think it's just so wrong, and it's such an ahistorical interpretation of what happened. The basic reality is that, just because something was possible in November of 2024, when Russia was winning the war, when Ukraine is losing, just because the giving Ukraine the capacity to strike into Russia didn't lead to an escalation, that doesn't mean that it wouldn't have led to an escalation 2 years earlier when Russia was on its back foot. And I think this is something that people really don't understand. And I'm worried that there's almost like a conscious effort to take the wrong lessons away from the experience that we've had over the course of the last couple of years. And I also think that there's a contradiction in there in the way that we think about Russia. But I'm interested in your reaction to my sort of critique do you see this same emerging sort of critique of Biden policy?
I see that critique. It's not new. It's been there almost from the start.
Of course, yeah.
But it has grown. But I think that the critiques have kind of grown dialectically. So there's a counter critique, which I think is also on the ascent, which is that, okay, it looks like we're heading toward negotiations. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump won the American presidency. That was not an unforeseeable, shocking event. There was roughly a 50-50 chance of that happening for years.
Yeah.
And Ukraine is now in a weaker position from which to negotiate. So why didn't this happen sooner? Why were we at least not preparing for the 50-50 chance of a Trump presidency? So the taboo on negotiations has been lifted. It was lifted almost instantly after Trump won the U.S. election
I know,
in
it's
November.
really remarkable.
And then, right, all of a sudden there was this, now we're having an actual conversation about what kind of terms would be acceptable, what might be acceptable to the Russians, the Ukrainians, the United States. Oh, we could have been doing this long ago. So I think, the Biden administration had a certain approach that satisfied nobody in a sense. It didn't satisfy the maximalists who thought Ukraine should
take back all its territory.
Take back all its territory and have a complete, uncontestable victory.
Take back all its territory, join NATO, right?
Right, the whole litany. Yeah. It didn't satisfy those who wanted the war to end more quickly,
right,
or thought that the United States didn't have an interest that justified the kind of escalation risks that we were taking, the financial costs associated with an open-ended conflict that didn't seem to have an end game. And so I think both of those sides are advancing at the same time. And from where I sit, it's unclear what's taking the upper hand, right? Is it the maximalist view or the restraint view? And I think both of these interpretations are represented in the incoming administration. So this is an important question, right? Not just
it's true.
in an intellectual sense, but in a live policy.
We tend to think about Trump as sort of only in the negotiation point of view, but obviously there are a lot of people, senior people.
And it might be that Donald Trump personally leans toward a negotiation, let's settle this thing quickly perspective, but the person he's appointed to be special envoy for the conflict, General Keith Kellogg, really straddles both of these positions. The most telling piece of writing he put out last spring about the conflict, in which he criticizes the Biden administration for not negotiating, but also criticizes the Biden administration for tying Ukraine's hands and not putting more pressure on Russia.
And I think that's a convenient position for Republicans to take, and a logical one. And actually, I mostly agree with it. I mean, I think that if they do go forward with this negotiation, they've got the right basic strategy, which is to put pressure on both sides to come to the negotiating table for a ceasefire. I mean, it's almost a no-brainer, right? I mean, that's what you need to do. And so I'm supportive of that. My concern is that the implementation of that strategy is going to be extremely complicated, going to require a lot of alliance management, that they need to do a lot of diplomatic spade work to make work, so that allies are supportive of this approach and don't try to sabotage it out of fear for their own domestic political reasons or whatever. They have to think about how to bring in other nations outside of Europe into this conversation. Certainly, they need to consider whether or not India, which has a close relationship with Russia, should play a role, whether or not countries like Brazil, South Africa that have been so critical can play some kind of a supportive role in trying to push the process forward.
Do you think that the war in Ukraine will still be going on this time next year?
Probably. But we can hope that we will be closer to some kind of a ceasefire than we are today, and that there have been realistic steps towards it, which has not occurred. I mean, I called for that 2 years ago in that article that I wrote in The Economist, and I tried to say, okay, well, where should we be 6 months from now to try and set real, goals? And of course, none of that has happened. But I think with the Trump administration, we can realistically hope that a year from now we will be getting close. A serious effort will have been made. I mean, after all, it took a year and a half for the Korea armistice to be signed that basically brought the Korean War to an end, and that's more or less what we're hoping for here.
That sounds right to me. I mean, one of the things I am concerned about is that negotiations will take place this year. I think the Russians and the Ukrainians have the incentive, if Trump is really pushing it, to come to the table and at least look like they are entertaining a ceasefire.
Yeah.
But the Russians seem to feel that they're in a strong position.
Militarily, they are.
They are. And Putin's concerns, to my mind, have long been about the European security architecture, first and foremost, as opposed to Ukraine. The discussion in the United States about the settlement of the war has focused on Ukraine-specific issues, territory, security guarantees, Ukraine's army lifting sanctions on Russia, et cetera. Obviously, those are core issues. But, if you have a Russia that is not desperate to settle the war, thinks that it could get a better deal with respect to those Ukraine-specific issues in another year or so, Russia may come back to some of its concerns that it presented prior to the full-scale
In other words, it
invasion.
may insist on the bigger deal that it's been trying to get since the 1990s rather than just accept an end to the fighting.
Right. And if it's Putin's primary concern, this may be his moment of maximum leverage to push that. If that's what he wants to achieve, he'll have to ask himself,
I mean, I think
when I'm going to be in a
position.
position.
I mean, I don't think that's going to, those ideas are not going to work. They're not going to work for the United States, and they're not going to work for America's allies in Europe. So, but I agree with you. It could go that way. It certainly would not put it past the Russians.
I'm not sure they're not going to work completely. I think the question is, what would the Russians be willing to accept, and what would the United States and its allies be willing to give? Now, certainly the extreme demands of basically rolling back NATO.
Getting rid of NATO and stuff like that.
No, that's not going to happen. But if we're talking about, a new kind of CFE treaty where we establish limits on armaments that are, both on the eastern flank of NATO, but also reciprocally on Russia's western border, if we're talking about reversing the steps to introduce medium-range missiles in Europe, perhaps we could even talk about, NATO not expanding further, not just with respect to Ukraine, but more generally. Those are the kind of areas where maybe you could see
as part of, but I still don't. I think if Russia's position is we're not going to stop the war until we settle those issues, that's a super long war.
I agree with you.
But I can imagine a situation in which there is a ceasefire, that is, albeit tenuous, and potentially as part of that agreement, there is an agreement to talk about these other issues, to restart some of the fora that existed, in the past, to explore these more openly with Russia. That I could maybe see getting there.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm optimistic, though, about the ceasefire happening first. So I think maybe, the sequencing would have to be worked out to get to the ceasefire with a promise to continue dialogues. But I think this is an issue that may catch U.S. negotiators unaware. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I wanted to bring it up.
Well, it also is an issue that, the things that you're talking about require a lot of technical expertise. If you're talking about CFE, you're talking about a very technical set of issues. So the Trump administration will need to find people who can advise them and bring those people into that discussion if there's going to be any hope of success. And here's where I just don't know. Because there's a whole other scenario here, right, where, potentially your incoming president thinks that he can just sit down with Putin and settle this, as he said. Whether or not he actually thinks that, I have no idea. But if he does, that's going to be tough. And if it goes badly, then what happens? Then does the momentum in the Trump administration just pull the plug on support for Ukraine? I don't think that would be so great. A sort of uncontrolled Russian advance across Ukraine towards Poland. And I think that sounds very scary. It's too risky for my taste. Or alternatively, does a mano negotiation with Putin fail and then Trump gets mad and decides he's going to double down on Ukraine or do something very aggressive against Russia in the military or in another sphere? And how does that play out? So those are two sort of branching scenarios off of my preferred one, which is successful or at least moderately successful continued ceasefire negotiations that I'm also concerned about. And those also could be places where we are a year from now.
Yeah, I think that's an underrated concern, that actually we may be headed toward escalation in U.S. support for Ukraine precisely because Putin does not prove to be the malleable, pragmatic figure that Trump imagines he will be. And then Trump maybe has already made threats to double down on support for Ukraine or tighten sanctions on Russia or something like that to try to bring Russia to the table. Michael Kimmage has written earliest, I think, about this possibility that a Trump administration might escalate the war.
I want to run an idea by you that I've been turning over in my head, which is about, I see this contradiction in how the Europeans, the community of European security experts is approaching Russia when it comes to Ukraine and then when it comes to Europe. Because it seems to me that with regard to Ukraine, there is this idea that, Russia is a paper tiger and that if the United States and NATO would just push harder and give Ukraine more support, Russia would collapse, withdraw, Ukraine would get all of its territory back. But these are often the same people who are in arguments about European deterrence saying that Russia is this gigantic threat and that Russian tanks are, going to be, again, at the Brandenburg Gate unless NATO really gets its act together, spends way more on defense, unless the United States beefs up its security posture in Europe, that there's this massive threat that Russia poses to NATO. And I can't help but feel like those are kind of contradictory, right? I mean, is Russia this paper tiger that's about to fold in Ukraine? Or is it the case that if we don't stop it in Ukraine, it's going to be doing a parade on Unter den Linden in Berlin?
Doesn't seem like it can be both.
Right.
This is a feature of U.S. foreign policy discourse that I think goes beyond Ukraine. I think you see some similar attitudes toward China when, depending on the time of day, China can be portrayed as, on the verge of world domination, but also really weak. And if we just push a little harder, China's power is actually peaking and it could be headed toward the decline. So it's kind of worth investigating on an ideological and historical level. But it has become acute, I agree, in the case of Russia and Ukraine. And I'll just, even more specifically, there's an idea that NATO is the ultimate security guarantee,
right,
the ultimate deterrent. And so if we just take a leap of faith and let Ukraine into NATO, then everything will be fine. But on the other hand, if Russia conquers Ukraine, or even if it doesn't, NATO territory is deeply vulnerable to Russia. So which is it?
Yeah. But I mean, I think it's good that you raised the idea of Ukraine in NATO, because this is obviously another big issue in 2024 with the 75th anniversary summit of NATO here over the summer, which, as you would have expected, produced a lot of, not that new, but another round of discussion about whether or not Ukraine should join NATO, with a lot of pressure from America's allies, particularly in Central Europe, that it ought to. Ukraine itself, perhaps somewhat more muted than the year before, but nevertheless still pushing for it. And a large and, I think, growing number of experts in Washington who are supportive of the idea at some point. And we saw the Biden administration kind of try to fudge it and say that no, not a Ukrainian membership in NATO now, but a brightly lit bridge towards membership. And that policy didn't really satisfy anyone. So what I've been thinking about is, from a strategy perspective, the discussion is all about whether or not Ukraine should be in NATO. And that's just not the right way to frame any kind of big question like that. The question is, should Ukraine be brought into NATO, or should we do something else for Ukraine? And I'm among those who think that probably there are better options, but no one has really spent that much time in Washington, D.C. We need to do more to sort of flesh out what those alternatives are. So it doesn't seem like a choice between Ukraine is in NATO or Ukraine is sort of, left to its own fate, predated upon by Russia for all of eternity. Because first of all, that would not be a good outcome just in and of itself. But also, you're never going to get Ukraine to engage in any kind of a serious negotiation if that's the other option, and we rule out NATO. So, what do you think? Do you think there are other options that are out there that are actively being discussed here?
Well, there was the attempt to come up with the so-called Israel model, I think unfortunately named because Israel has nuclear weapons, for Ukraine. I think part of the issue is that the Ukrainian government itself seems to believe that the NATO option is a real live possibility.
I just wonder where they're getting that idea.
In part, they keep sort of pressuring us to provide the next weapons system, and we
then
do.
We do it. So, they've been pretty successful in the past.
Yeah.
Good point.
And we're saying we're not going to let you into NATO now.
Yeah.
But maybe after the war. My sense from talking to people in the administration, I don't know how you read this, is that they're actually just not sure what they think of Ukraine joining NATO in a post-war situation should be. I think they're decided that it should not happen while the war is ongoing, because that would draw the United States into the war. But I don't think that there was a clear policy. So I think, frankly, the Ukrainians could be forgiven for wondering maybe this is a real possibility for us. I also wonder whether there's a kind of, status-based view where you look at the map, all these countries around Ukraine got into NATO. And we're actually fighting the Russians. Why not us?
Right.
From a justice, fairness perspective, absolutely. I cannot think of a good reason why Ukraine doesn't deserve it, But that's not actually the governing logic here, or the logic that needs to govern this difficult decision, because it's not going to happen, and it would be dangerous if it did, in fact, because Ukraine's situation is in crucial ways different from other countries that joined. But going back to your point a minute ago, my view has long been that Russia poses a serious threat to its neighbors, to countries along its borders.
Well, demonstrably.
Yeah, but not a very serious threat to do something like overrun the European continent, which I think is also pretty demonstrable.
It's not going to happen.
And I think that that's a kind of hard view for a lot of people to maintain in this strange way, even though it kind of seems obvious, because then it raises the question, well, can we really depend on the United States or even, countries in Western Europe, France, Germany, to come to the defense of countries that are vulnerable to Russia, if in fact the threat to themselves or to what they've defined as their vital interests seems quite limited.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show.
All right, so let's turn to Asia, and maybe there's an argument that Asia was the bright spot for the United States, even though it's home to the number one strategic competitor of the United States, China. Do you think that's right?
I think it's a really interesting observation, and I was thinking somewhat similarly that at least things in the U.S. China relationship in 2024, there was sustained tension that we expected based upon what had been happening in the last couple of years. There wasn't any, balloon surveillance incident. There wasn't any major new area of conflict introduced into the relationship. And I think everybody is kind of, acclimated to the fact that the United States continues to put tariffs on Chinese exports. The Biden administration put tariffs on Chinese EVs, for example, and a bunch of other goods back in the spring. Trump is obviously threatening to do more. We continue to expand restrictions on cooperation with Chinese firms that work with the Chinese defense industry. There's a big debate about the use of Chinese drones in the United States. Obviously, we have continued Chinese cyber attacks on the U.S. We have Chinese aggressive behavior towards its neighbors in the South China Sea. And then we've got continuing tension over Taiwan. But all of these things are not new in 2024. All of them existed beforehand. So I think there is a sort of sense that, it was a state of sustained tension. And here's what concerns me about this is that I have a feeling when I talk to other analysts in Washington about China, and I observe the way in which our political discussion on China has unfolded over the course of the last few years, is that people are, because of this acclimatization to this state of sustained tension, people are basically accepting that we're headed towards a new Cold War, and they're taking actions based upon that assumption. And that makes it more and more of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I don't think that a new Cold War with China is in America's interest. I agree. It's possible that we may end up there, but we shouldn't accept it as a foregone conclusion. And that's why, as you know, I embarked on the project that we did over the course of 2024 to try to sketch what an alternative scenario for the future of U.S. China relations might look like, one in which the U.S. and China are coexisting, certainly with all of these tensions that we're talking about, but that the relationship just doesn't continue to perpetually deteriorate into a state of economic decoupling with risks of major war, because that is something that we ought to be going to great lengths to try to avoid.
I don't think we got closer in the past year towards a Cold War with China, though. So I guess I'm slightly more optimistic about an overall situation about which I am very pessimistic.
Shed your optimism. I want to hear it. Yeah.
The fact that this was an election year. So if I went back a few years ago and said, we're having an election between Biden turned Harris and Donald Trump in 2024, what do you think the dynamics of U.S. China relations will be, both bilaterally and in U.S. domestic politics? I would say I think, it's going to be a rough year. And in a way, the so-called spirit of Woodside, the summit between Xi and Biden from, I think it was November 2023,
yeah.
It kind of held. Both sides, for their own reasons, wanted a degree of stability in the relationship this year. Dialogues were ongoing. I totally agree. There's not much room for, optimism on any fundamental issues. Nothing was solved. All the trends that pre-existed 2024 are continuing. I think you're right that, maybe people are accepting the descent into what seems to be a Cold War. But I guess what I see as a potential opportunity in a second Trump administration is that on the geopolitical issues, which Trump himself cares less about than the economic ones, he might be more willing to take actions that make the relationship a little bit better. Trump has made noises, including recently, about how unfair it would be for the United States to defend Taiwan in a conflict, given what Taiwan spends on defense. He even claimed that Taiwan stole our semiconductors, which I'm not so sure about that one. But, he's applied this anti-allied view to Taiwan a number of times. I think one can infer that he would not be keen on defending Taiwan if it came down to it, and doesn't want to provoke China over Taiwan to make an attack more likely. I think one of the things that, is maybe not beyond Trump, again, not predicting, but not beyond him, would be to issue new assurances to China. If you want to be really dramatic about it, it could be in a fourth U.S. PRC joint communique, but it doesn't have to be, in which the United States would try to show Beijing that it is serious about sticking with the one China policy and it's not going to degrade it as has happened over the last 4 or 5 years or so. So that could take the form of, a declaration that, the United States does not support Taiwan independence, and not only that, under no circumstances would it support Taiwan independence so long as China does not use armed force against Taiwan. The fact that Trump has now remade the Republican Party and unified it around him perhaps makes it a little less necessary for the GOP to be anti-China to hold itself together. Remember that in the first Trump administration, being anti-China was really something that could hold that party together because the Trump MAGA wing agreed, and so did the traditionalists, including the neoconservative element. Today, it's a party unified around Trump. And so what Trump wants to do, I think the party will go with him, more or less, or at least he sets the boundaries of legitimate debate and thinking among the GOP. So I'm not saying he won't get pushback from members of Congress in the party if he does things that they don't like, but I think there's a little more space now for Trump to do things on China that are not just in a unidirectional, more confrontation, more competition direction. So that's the first point I'll make. The second point is that I think if you were to embed some diplomatic reassurances to China in the context of a pretty hard-nosed China policy, not just economic, but also in terms of a likely military buildup in East Asia, as well as, more pressure on Taiwan to build up its defenses and more U.S. aid to Taiwan in that regard, then I think it would be hard to say that that's a sort of soft on China approach overall, and it would actually suit Trump's own kind of penchant for, being diplomatic with adversaries
doing deals,
as well,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right, doing deals
yeah.
as well as being strong and competitive.
Well, it's an interesting theory.
You're sold,
again,
right?
I'm trying to imagine the conversation, going on in the Oval Office the way that you've just had it. But I agree with you that 5 or 10 years from now we could be in a better position with China than we are right now. One in which America's vital interests are defended and things are more stable. There's less risk of a rapidly escalating conflict, where economic exchange, even if diminished from where it was before the pandemic, is still positive and relatively healthy, where both sides have adjusted to some degree to the reality of each other's existence. And that's basically what we tried to lay out in the compendium. So I just think that we need to have some active efforts. Again, this is a question of the analytic community here in Washington to try to put forward ideas that nudge the United States in that direction. I think it's important, although by no means sufficient, for Beijing to see those kinds of conversations happening here in Washington among people who are taken seriously. And I hope it's something that we can continue to do in our program here. I wanted a minute to think about how you would grade the Biden administration. Because, for example, I'll give them on these 3 issues that we've been talking about. I think they should have high marks on China. I give them an A. I think that the political environment, for all the reasons that we've just been talking about here in Washington, has been really difficult, and that they have successfully managed to sustain a serious high-level dialogue with Beijing in spite of criticisms from both Republicans and within their own party, and with a million other things going on in the world. So I give them a lot of credit for that. What do you think?
I'm going lower than an A. I mean, I do think that when we're looking at the 3 regions we've discussed today, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia, Asia is the best case for Biden administration success. I also think that it corresponds the best to the results that have obtained after 4 years.
The original goals, right?
Exactly, what the Biden administration intended to do.
Yeah, okay.
And that's a way of, evaluating criteria, So, maybe a B. I think I'd be tempted to go higher if not for...
What does it take to get an A?
So honestly,
Stephen students are listening.
This is really simple, but Biden's 4 statements saying that the United States would defend Taiwan, several statements expressing sort of indifference to Taiwanese independence, saying, it's up to the people of Taiwan to decide what they want to do.
So you're marking them down on that.
I'm marking them down on that. I also think that the democracy versus autocracy framing,
yeah.
Again, simple. Like, you could have had different framing.
Yeah.
Obviously doesn't play well even among allies and partners in the region, but also does not play well in Beijing. And I think,
It just escalates the tensions for little gain.
Yeah, to me, those statements and those framings provided little gain and raised the risks of a major conflict, makes our misperceptions worse. And it also had an effect on our domestic politics because we had a huge freakout over Taiwan that isn't over. And that's one of the, again, opportunities, not predictions, but opportunities I see over the next 4 years. The so-called Davidson window of 2027, by which time Xi Jinping has, told his military he wants to be capable of mounting an invasion of Taiwan. Not the same as an intention to do it.
Which has been lost in so much of the discussion.
Which has been lost, but actually I'll credit the Biden administration for pouring cold water on that timeline.
Yeah.
That's been important. But if 2027 passes and there is not a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, maybe that helps to tamp down the fears that have become acute in the last few years.
Okay. Middle East.
Do we have grade inflation here?
No. Well, it's kind of up to you as the grader to decide how much you want to inflate the grade.
The Middle East, a C, maybe a D.
You give them failing grades?
Yeah. I'm just, the fact that we were even talking about a treaty commitment to defend Saudi Arabia is just, we've just so lost the plot.
Gone off the rails, yeah.
Yeah, so D. And Gaza, too, is just
I give them, I think that the Middle East has been an area where the Biden administration, which came in with the intention of reducing America's commitment to the region, with the very important exception of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, for which we have to give them huge credit. They paid a big political price for that, and it was absolutely the right thing to do. After that, the policies in the region have really gone in the opposite direction of a greater American commitment rather than a lesser one. And strategically, that just doesn't make sense. And we've incurred all of these costs.
You've convinced me to go down to a D minus. Number one, Afghanistan is in South Asia, so I'm going to exclude Afghanistan from the Middle East.
Yeah,
Number two, you've reminded me of the original intention expressed during the campaign and expressed early on in the Biden administration of really extricating the United States from the region. And so, not only have the results been bad, but measured against the original intention, at least of some in the administration, it's even worse than I had thought a moment ago.
So what about Europe?
I guess I'm going back to my stack of Bs, maybe a B plus. I mean, you can't overlook the fact that the administration did allow Ukraine to remain standing as a sovereign country.
Which was a good outcome.
Good outcome.
Yeah.
And they did, rally the Europeans to support Ukraine. And today, Europe is doing quite a bit for Ukraine. I don't think it's altogether clear that if U.S. support drops a lot, that Ukraine's situation will be helpless.
It's going to be pretty tough for the Ukrainians if that happens.
Tough, but there has been a lot of European contribution.
Agree.
So I'm having trouble here because I think it could have been a lot better, right? I think for all the reasons we talked about, the administration was like a few notches away from a really good policy that I'd give an A for. So,
yeah, I give them a B. I agree with you completely that they did succeed in preventing Ukraine from losing its sovereignty, which I think was the right objective at the beginning of the war. And they also did that without a major escalation with Russia, which I think, again, is a risk that is right now being discounted, but was very real and, frankly, remains real as we look ahead, although maybe is a little less real now that Russia is winning the war. But I do feel that they overpromised in the process of doing this to Ukraine, and that promise has extended the war and increased the level of suffering beyond what might have been possible if there had been a more realistic effort from the start to convince Ukraine to adopt more realistic war aims.
What about on the sort of holistic, grand strategic level? How do you grade the administration on sort of where American power stands today after 4 years of the Biden administration?
It's a great question. I'm inclined to give him a B. I think the relationship with China is the most important one for the future. It's not the only one by any means. I think that they have dealt with that, not by any means perfectly, but fairly well. I think that at the same time, they've made decisions which amount to an overextension of American power in the world, especially in the Middle East, as we've been talking about. And while I understand the reasons why those individual decisions were made, I wonder whether or not some of the people who have been running Biden's foreign policy, as they look back on the last 4 years, will wonder how they ended up being so heavily committed in Europe, the Middle East, when their primary intention, as I understand it, was to focus on China. So it's certainly not a fail, but it's not a smashing success either. In the Statecraft program, you and I, Chris, Aaron, all of the junior people who are working with us are doing lots of analysis of this kind, so there's definitely more to come, both in formats like this, in our public events, and obviously in the writing that people like you do so prolifically in so many different outlets around Washington and, of course, around the world.
Well, thank you, Chris. This was lots of fun, albeit in a sterile studio environment. But I think
we'll try to arrange a Tuscan villa for the next time we do this. Yeah.
Now we're talking. And of course, listeners, if they were intrigued by what they heard, can look up the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment and get much more from us.
Yeah, and we're always interested in what people who are following our work have to say about it and what's interesting to them or what their concerns are about American foreign policy and America's role in the world.
You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find our episodes on Carnegie's YouTube channel as well. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Thanks to the excellent Heewon Park, who is our audio engineer and executive producer, and to Cameron Zotter, who is our videographer. I'm Sophia Besch, Senior Fellow in the Euro Program and host of The World Unpacked. Thanks for listening.